The bridge railing shattered like paper. 1 second the black SUV was there, headlights cutting through the blizzard, and the next it was gone, swallowed by 60 feet of darkness and freezing river water below. Logan Carter had exactly 4 seconds to decide. He was 37 years old, had a daughter in the back seat, and hadn't been in a fight or a crisis in 3 years. He stopped the truck, looked at Ava in the rearview mirror, and said, "Don't move. Lock the doors." Then he was already running. If this kind of story grips you, the ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when everything is on the line, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Every week we bring you cinematic tales of courage, survival, and the unexpected ways people find each other when life tears everything apart. Like this video before we go any further, and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. We genuinely want to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to that bridge. The storm had been building since early afternoon, the kind that the Weather Service names and then quietly apologizes for underestimating. By 7:30 that evening, Highway 6 through Clear Creek Canyon was a sheet of packed ice under 6 inches of fresh powder, and the plows hadn't made it out from Denver yet. The wind came off the Rockies in hard, sideways gusts that turned headlights into blurred smears and made the reflective guardrails look like they were breathing. Logan Carter had been driving this stretch of road for 3 years. He knew where it turned mean. The 09 F250 had almost 200,000 miles on it, and Logan had rebuilt the engine himself. Twice. The heater worked, barely, and Ava had her knees pulled up to her chest in the back seat with a blanket around her shoulders and her earbuds in, half asleep against the window. She'd had a school winter performance that evening. She'd played a sheep in a nativity-adjacent skit that the school carefully called a Winter Wonderland show, and she'd taken it more seriously than Logan had taken most of his military deployments. He'd sat in the third row of the gymnasium with 30 other parents, still wearing his work jacket that smelled faintly of motor oil, and he'd clapped until his hands hurt. That was the night he'd had. Simple. Small. His. He saw the semi first, the jackknifed Peterbilt sitting at a 45-degree angle across both northbound lanes about 200 yards ahead, its hazard lights strobing orange in the snow. Logan eased off the gas immediately, downshifting, keeping the truck stable. He'd started to slow to a stop when the black Escalade coming southbound hit the same ice patch the semi had obviously found. And Logan watched it happen the way you watch something awful and irreversible, with that terrible clarity that comes just before the moment you can no longer do anything about it. The Escalade's rear end stepped out. The driver corrected, too hard, too fast, and overcorrected. The vehicle fishtailed left, caught the low guardrail with its passenger side, and the rail, which had probably been due for replacement for 2 winters now, gave way with a sound Logan could hear even through his closed windows and the howling wind. Like a gunshot. Like something snapping that wasn't supposed to snap. Then it was gone. Logan was already pulling over before he consciously decided to. He had the truck stopped on the shoulder and his door opened before Ava even stirred. "Daddy?" "Lock the doors behind me," he said. His voice came out flat, calm. Not the kind of calm that takes effort. The other kind, the kind that's been trained into a person until it stops being a choice. "Do not get out of this truck. You understand me?" She sat up, took out an earbud, and looked at him with her mother's eyes, dark brown and immediate, already reading the situation. 8 years old, and she read situations like a kid twice her age. "Okay," she said quietly. "Good." He grabbed the emergency flashlight from the center console. "I'll be right back." He was lying, and he didn't know it yet. Chum. The river was called Clear Creek, which felt like a cruel joke in winter. It was 40 feet wide at that section of the canyon, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above, and in December it ran dark and fast and savagely cold. The temperature that night was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill was somewhere nobody wanted to calculate. Logan got to the railing, the gap in it, the torn and jagged edge, and looked down. The Escalade had gone in nose first and was already submerged to its roofline, caught briefly on a submerged boulder, and the current was working at it methodically. He could see the headlights beneath the surface, still on, casting pale green-white light through 6 feet of black water. It looked unreal, like something from a nightmare someone else was having. He didn't see anyone swimming away. Nobody had gotten out. Logan pulled off his jacket, then his boots. He'd need to kick freely in the water. He kept his thermal shirt and jeans on for whatever good that would do, and he was over the railing and into the river before the voice in his head that handled self-preservation could get a full sentence out. The cold hit him like a physical assault, not cold like winter air, cold like something clamping down on his chest and squeezing. He'd been in cold water training at BUD/S. He'd operated in the North Atlantic. He knew what his body would do, and he had maybe 4 minutes before his fine motor control started going, and maybe 10 before the cold became lethal. He filed that information away and swam. The Escalade had shifted. The boulder was losing the argument with the current, and the vehicle was rotating slowly. Logan dove, found the driver's side door by feel more than sight, and pulled. Locked. He surfaced, grabbed a breath, dove again. The driver's window. He didn't have a glass breaker on him. He'd left everything in the truck. So he used his elbow, twice, and the third time it spiderwebbed, and he drove his fist through the center of it. He felt the cut immediately, felt the warmth of blood that he couldn't actually see in the dark water, and shoved that information into the same folder as the cold. Later. Deal with it later. Inside, through the murk and the last pale glow of the instrument panel, he could see her. A woman. Unconscious, slumped against the door, still buckled in. There was blood from her forehead where she'd hit the wheel or the window or both. He couldn't tell if she was breathing. You can't tell anything in 6 feet of turbulent water. But she hadn't drowned yet, and that had to be enough reason. Logan got his arm around her torso, found the seatbelt clasp by feel, pressed it. Nothing. He pressed it again. Still nothing. Jammed, probably, or deformed from the impact. His lungs were starting to burn. He yanked the seatbelt once, hard, and it gave enough for him to twist her sideways, and then he pulled her through the broken window. The current caught them both the moment they cleared the vehicle. He didn't fight it. You don't fight Clear Creek in December. You angle across it, and you use whatever the current gives you. Logan kept his grip on the woman's coat collar, kept her face above water, his face was barely above water, and worked obliquely toward the opposite bank, the south bank, the one without a road but with a shallow gravel shelf he'd noticed driving past 100 times and never once thought he'd need. The Escalade, freed from the boulder, went downstream in the dark without them. He got his feet under him in 2 feet of water, stumbling on the rocks, and he dragged her the last 20 feet onto the gravel shelf and got her up on her side. She coughed. Then she coughed again, water coming out of her, and she made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a groan, and Logan let out a breath he didn't remember holding. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. His teeth were starting to chatter. "Stay with me. You're out of the water. You're okay." She didn't respond. Her eyes were open, barely, slitted, and she was looking at him without any apparent recognition of what she was seeing. Concussion, shock, both. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck and found her pulse, rapid, which was fear and shock, but present, which was everything. He looked around. The north bank was across 40 feet of freezing river. His truck was up there, along with his phone and his daughter. Downstream, maybe a quarter mile, the canyon curved, and he hoped, there was a maintenance road that came down to creek level. "Okay," he said, more to himself than to her. "Okay." He got his thermal shirt off. The cold immediately became something that didn't have a clean word for it, and pressed the shirt against the cut on her forehead. She winced. Her hand came up weakly and grabbed his wrist, not pulling it away, just holding on. "You're safe," he told her. "I've got you." He wasn't sure she heard him. Her eyes had closed again. Namasan. It took him 22 minutes to find the maintenance access road, carry her up to the highway level, flag down a passing truck. A utility worker who took one look at Logan, shirtless and bleeding in 11-degree weather, carrying an unconscious woman, and didn't ask a single question, and get her loaded into the back of the utility truck with a thermal blanket from the worker's emergency kit. While the worker called 911, Logan jogged back along the shoulder to his own truck. Ava had the doors locked exactly as he'd told her. She unlocked them the moment she saw him and launched herself between the front seats before he'd even gotten behind the wheel, wrapping both arms around his neck and not saying anything, just holding on. "I'm okay," he said. His teeth were still going. He was shaking hard now, the controlled crash of adrenaline leaving the system. "I'm okay, Bug. I'm right here." "You're freezing," she said, and her voice had that particular steadiness children develop when they're very scared and working very hard not to show it. She sounded just like her mother. "Yeah." He peeled her arms off gently and grabbed the spare jacket from behind the seat. A canvas work jacket, not warm enough, but something. "I know, we're going home." "Is she okay? The lady in the car?" Logan thought about the woman's grip on his wrist, the strength in it, even barely conscious, even half drowned. "I think so," he said. Help was coming for her. He pulled back onto the highway and drove north, away from the flashing lights that were just now appearing on the southern horizon. Ambulances, highway patrol, news vans probably not far behind. A utility worker who knew nothing but the shape of the situation would give his description: tall, big through the shoulders, driving an old dark-colored pickup. That was fine. That was manageable. Logan Carter didn't want his name in anyone's story. He'd spent enough years in operations where names got people killed. He just wanted to take his daughter home, get warm, and let this night become something that happened, and then was over. That's not what it became. Charlotte Hayes woke up in a private room at St. Anthony Summit Medical Center at 2:17 in the morning with a CT-confirmed concussion, 4 stitches in her forehead, mild hypothermia that was already resolving, and a memory gap that covered approximately 40 minutes around the time of the crash. What she did remember: the semi coming out of nowhere across the lane, the guardrail, the sensation, horrible, nauseating, of nothing being under the wheels anymore. What she didn't remember: the water, getting out. How she'd ended up on a gravel bank with a folded thermal shirt pressed to her head. What she remembered with strange, specific clarity, despite everything else being fractured and dark: a voice. "Stay with me. You're okay." And a hand, not gentle exactly, but certain. The way a person is certain when they've been in bad situations before and know that certainty is what keeps other people from falling apart. She'd grabbed that wrist. She remembered that clearly. The wrist and the pulse she could feel in it, and the way it convinced her she was still alive. Her assistant, Mira, had been there since 3 a.m. Her head of security, a careful, deliberate man named Desmond, arrived at 4. The Colorado State Patrol sent 2 investigators at 6. Charlotte sat through all of it, answered every question she could, and kept coming back to the same thing. "Who pulled me out?" she asked the first investigator. He checked his notes. "A utility worker named Brent Salazar reported finding you on the south bank of the creek and transported you to the highway for emergency services. He didn't witness the rescue itself." "Then who performed the rescue?" Another check. "Unknown at this time, Mr." Salazar described a man he encountered briefly. Late 30s, well-built, shirtless despite the temperature, driving an older pickup. He left before units arrived. He paused, clearly thinking this was odd. He didn't give his name. Charlotte stared at the ceiling of her hospital room for a long moment. Shirtless in 11-degree weather. She thought about the shirt that had been pressed to her forehead. Thought about what that meant. That someone had taken off their own shirt in the cold to stop her from bleeding. "Find him," she told Desmond quietly, after the investigators left. Desmond, who had worked corporate security for 14 years and was not easily surprised, looked at her carefully. "The police? Not the police. Me. I want to know who he is." She met his eyes. "Someone risked their life to pull me out of a submerged vehicle in freezing water, and then just left. That's not nothing. That's not someone you don't try to find." Desmond nodded slowly. He didn't argue. In 14 years, he'd learned which of Charlotte's decisions were worth discussing and which had already been decided at a level she didn't consciously access. This was the second kind. 3 days later, sitting in the back of a car on her way to a board meeting that would reshape the next 2 years of her professional life, Charlotte pulled up the security footage Desmond had sourced from a traffic camera on Highway 6. 42 seconds of low-resolution video, snow-distorted, shot from a bad angle. Enough to see an older Ford pickup, dark blue or black, impossible to tell, parked on the shoulder. Enough to see a figure moving at the guardrail. Enough, barely, to see him go over. The timestamp, 7:41 p.m. 12 minutes before the first emergency unit arrived on scene. Desmond had identified a partial plate. DMV records, cross-referenced with the vehicle description, had come back to one registered owner in Clear Creek County. Logan Carter. 2009 Ford F-25. Oh, dark navy. Registered address, a town called Idaho Springs, about 20 miles east of where the crash had occurred. She pulled up everything Desmond had compiled. 37 years old. Father, one child, age 8. Co-owner of a small auto repair shop, Carter and Son Automotive, though the son had apparently become the sole proprietor after his own father retired 2 years ago. Widower. Prior military service, branch Navy. Nothing more specific than that. Some records that Desmond noted were either sealed or simply no longer in accessible databases. Charlotte looked at that last part for a long time. Records that were either sealed or simply no longer accessible. The board meeting was in 20 minutes. The Meridian merger had to close by the end of Q1 or the window collapsed. 1,200 employees, 7 years of work, the largest deal her company had ever attempted. All of it waiting on her to walk into that room and be the person everyone needed her to be. She closed the file. She sat with the image from the traffic camera, the figure going over the guardrail, voluntary, choosing to go over. And she thought about the wrist, the certainty. The voice in the dark that told her she was safe in the same tone most people used for something they actually believed. She opened the file again. Desmond had included a physical description from a hospital nurse who'd briefly treated Logan 3 years earlier for a work-related hand injury. Brown hair, worn short, gray starting at the temples. 6'2", approximately 210, built like someone who'd spent a decade doing things that required being hard to stop. A scar along his left jawline, thin and old, another across the back of his right hand, newer. Charlotte Hayes had run a company since she was 26. She'd built it from 22 employees to 340. She'd sat across negotiating tables from men twice her age who'd assumed she'd fold, and she'd watched their assumptions become their problem. She had excellent instincts about people, and she trusted them, and her instincts right now were telling her something that made no practical or strategic sense whatsoever. She needed to meet him, not to thank him publicly, not to write him a check, not to have her PR team turn him into a story that made her company look human in a quarter when the merger would generate some ugly headlines. Not any of that, just to understand who goes over a bridge railing in the dark in the middle of a blizzard for a stranger. What kind of person does that? What it costs them? And why someone like that drives away without leaving his name? Her phone buzzed. Marcus, her CFO. Boardroom ready. You good? She typed back, 5 minutes. She closed the file for the second time, and this time she left it closed. There was a merger to close. There was always a merger to close. There were always 17 things that needed her to be present and sharp and entirely focused on the room she was in. She was good at that. She was very good at that. But in the car, with the snow coming down outside the window in thin veils across the downtown buildings, she found herself thinking about a gravel bank in a frozen canyon and a man who'd walked back to his truck and driven north and let himself disappear. And she could not for the life of her figure out whether that made him the most humble person she'd ever not quite met or the most lonely. Maybe, she thought, those were sometimes the same thing. The Meridian merger closed on a Thursday, 14 minutes before the deadline, in a glass conference room on the 38th floor of a building in downtown Denver. Charlotte signed the last page with a pen someone had handed her. She didn't notice whose, and the room broke into the kind of controlled professional applause that corporate people produce when they're relieved, but too tired to be genuinely happy about it. Marcus shook her hand. Someone opened champagne. Charlotte drank half a glass and spent the next 3 hours in back-to-back calls with integration teams, legal, and a journalist from the Wall Street Journal she'd been putting off for 2 weeks. By the time she got back to her apartment, it was past 10. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in her work clothes, and looked at the file on her tablet. Logan Carter, Idaho Springs, Carter and Son Automotive, and made a decision that she knew wasn't entirely rational and didn't particularly care. She'd give herself 1 week. If she found him and he turned out to be a normal person who'd done a brave thing and wanted to be left alone, she would leave him alone. She'd have Mira draft a donation to whatever cause seemed appropriate and call it closed. But she needed to look him in the eye once. She needed to understand what she'd been holding on to for 11 days without being able to put it down. She was going to Idaho Springs. But she didn't take a driver. She told Mira she needed a long weekend for personal reasons, which was something she almost never said, so Mira didn't push. She rented a plain gray Honda CR-V from an airport lot rather than using the company account and pulled on jeans, a canvas barn jacket, and boots that had never actually seen mud. She was not, in any meaningful sense, a person who blended in. She'd been told this many times, usually by people who meant it as a compliment and didn't understand why it sometimes bothered her. But she did what she could. Idaho Springs was a mountain town that hadn't decided yet whether it was dying slowly or just resting. The main street had a real hardware store, 2 bars, a diner with a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising the breakfast special, and a number of storefronts that showed the particular vacancy of a building that used to be something and wasn't anymore. The canyon walls rose steeply on both sides of Clear Creek, which ran through the center of town, smaller and slower here than it had been the night it nearly killed her. Carter and Son Automotive was on a side street off the main drag, a 2-bay garage with a faded painted sign and a gravel lot with 4 customer vehicles in varying states of waiting. A hand-painted board near the entrance listed services and prices in black block letters, the kind of sign someone had painted themselves rather than ordered. Charlotte sat in the Honda across the street for a while. She felt suddenly and clearly like an idiot. She was a CEO who had rescued herself from an 11-day obsession by driving 2 hours into the mountains to stare at a garage. She almost left. She had the car running and her hand on the gear shift and everything. Then she saw him. He came out of the far bay wiping his hands on a rag, and even from across the street the identification was immediate. 6'2", exactly as the description said. Brown hair with gray at the temples, the scar along the jawline thin and pale. He was carrying a clipboard, and he stopped to look at something on it, and there was a quality to how he stood. Not posture, exactly, something less deliberate than that reminded her of the hand on her wrist in the dark. The certainty. The way some people occupy space without performing it. She got out of the car. What? She went in through the front office, which was small and smelled like coffee and rubber and old paperwork. A teenage boy behind the counter looked up from his phone. Help you? My car's been making a noise, Charlotte said. It was not technically untrue. The CR-V made a noise when she went over 35, though she'd assumed it was just the rental. What kind of noise? Kind of a rhythmic clicking, under the front. The boy nodded with the gravity of someone performing competence. Could be a CV axle, could be a lot of things. You want Logan to look at it? Sure, she said. That would be great. She waited. She looked at the framed photos on the wall. The original Carter, presumably the father, shaking hands with someone in front of the garage sometime in what looked like the 90s. A youth soccer team. A child's drawing, crayon on copy paper, of what was either a car or a very rectangular dog, taped to the edge of the counter with obvious care. Logan came in from the bay and stopped when he saw her, not with suspicion, just the automatic assessment that mechanics do when a new customer appears, registering the clothes, the car outside, the general category of person, and what they're likely to need. You've got a clicking noise, he said. It wasn't a question. The boy must have said something through the door. Front end, Charlotte said. It might be nothing. Might be. He picked up a key tag from the hook by the door. Leave the keys. I'll pull it in and take a look. His voice was what she remembered. Lower in person, without the distortion of water and wind and shock, but recognizable in its texture. She handed him the keys. Their fingers didn't touch. He barely looked at her. She sat in the small waiting area with a cup of coffee from a machine that produced something technically coffee adjacent, and she thought about what she was doing and continued doing it anyway. Bekampt. He found the noise in 20 minutes. CV joint, outer, right front, actually worn, which she hadn't expected. He came into the waiting area with the clipboard, showed her the notation, and quoted her a number that seemed, based on what she knew about car repairs, which was almost nothing, reasonable. How long? She asked. Hour and a half if the part's at the supplier. I'll call. He picked up the phone behind the counter, called the supplier, came back. 2 hours. You want to wait or come back? I'll wait. He nodded and went back to the bay. She waited. She drank more coffee. She watched the street through the window. After about 40 minutes, a school bus stopped at the corner and a small figure got off. A girl, 8 or 9, backpack bigger than she was, wearing a purple coat with a small tear on the left elbow that had been repaired with what looked like iron-on tape in a slightly wrong shade of purple. She came through the front door of the garage without knocking because it was clearly not a place she needed to knock. "Hey, Ray," she said to the teenager, who said, "Hey back." She dropped her backpack by the counter and looked at Charlotte with frank, uncomplicated curiosity. "Are you waiting for your car?" "I am," Charlotte said. "My dad's probably fixing it. He's good at fixing things." She said this plainly, as a statement of fact rather than a brag. "I'm Ava." "Charlotte." Ava climbed onto the chair 2 seats down from her and pulled a folder out of her backpack. Homework, math worksheets. She uncapped a pencil and started working, her tongue pressed slightly to the corner of her mouth in concentration. Charlotte watched her sideways and felt something she couldn't immediately name. The child moved through this space, the noisy, oil-smelling waiting room of a small garage, with complete ease the way children do when a place has always been theirs. This was her territory. The crayon drawing on the counter was probably hers. "Is your dad here a lot?" Charlotte asked, to have something to say. "Every day," Ava said, without looking up from her worksheet. "We have dinner in the back sometimes when he works late. There's a microwave." She paused to erase something. "He works late a lot in winter because that's when people's cars break." "That makes sense. What does your car sound like when it breaks?" Charlotte thought about it seriously. "Like someone dropped a handful of pennies in a fan." Ava considered this. "That's a good description. My dad says most people say it sounds like a rattling or a knocking, and that doesn't help at all." Charlotte almost smiled. "Well, I'm trying to be helpful." Logan came back out at the 2-hour mark, wiped his hands, and told her it was done. She paid in cash. She'd stopped at an ATM on the way up, thinking ahead, though she hadn't consciously known why, and while he made change, she looked at the scar across the back of his right hand. The one Desmond's file had called newer. She thought about submerged glass. "Thank you," she said. He looked up. Something in her voice or her face must have registered differently than routine customer gratitude, because he paused. "You're welcome," he said, and there was a slight question in it, understated, barely there. She picked up her keys. She walked to the door. She stopped. This was stupid. This was the most professionally uncharacteristic thing she'd done in a decade of professional life. She turned back. "I was in a crash on Highway 6 about 2 weeks ago," she said. "A vehicle went off the bridge near mile marker 31. The stillness that came over him was not the stillness of someone who didn't know what she was talking about. It was the opposite kind, the deliberate stillness of someone choosing not to react. "I heard about that," he said. "Did you?" He looked at her steadily. She looked back. In the bay behind him, she could hear a radio playing something country and low. "The woman in the car is okay," Charlotte said. "I just thought someone should know that." She held his gaze for another moment, then she walked out. She was 2 blocks down the street when she heard footsteps behind her, unhurried, not chasing her, but covering ground. "Hold on," Logan said. She stopped and turned. He was standing 10 feet away with his hands in the pockets of his work jacket, and he was looking at her the way she imagined he looked at a problem under the hood, trying to figure out what was actually wrong versus what it sounded like. The afternoon light was flat and gray off the snow, and it made the scar on his jaw more visible. "How'd you find me?" he asked. "Traffic camera on 6, partial plate, county DMV records." "You did that yourself?" "I had help." He breathed out through his nose, not quite a sigh. "I didn't want—" He stopped, tried again. "I didn't do it for recognition." "I know." She kept her voice even. "That's actually why I came, not to make it a big deal, not to put your name somewhere. She felt the inadequacy of the sentence before she finished it. "I woke up on a riverbank in the dark and someone was there, and then they weren't, and I couldn't stop thinking about who that was. That's all." He was quiet for a long moment. A truck went by on the street behind her, chains on its tires, the metallic clinking of it filling the space. "You doing okay?" he asked finally. "From the crash." The question was plainly practical, and it was the most human thing anyone had said to her in 2 weeks of people asking how she was doing. "Mostly," she said. "I lost about 40 minutes, I don't remember. Concussion. I'm told that's normal." He nodded. He looked like he might say something else and then decided against it. "I should get back," he said. "Of course." She paused. "Thank you for what you did. I know you don't want to hear it, but..." She stopped herself from adding anything decorative to the sentence. "Thank you." Logan Carter looked at her, not uncomfortably, not dismissively, just directly, and said, "Drive safe. The canyon's icy in the late afternoon when the temperature drops." Then he turned and walked back toward the garage. Charlotte stood on the sidewalk in Idaho Springs with the wind coming down the canyon and the smell of snow in it, and she thought, "I'm coming back." She did come back. 3 times in the following 2 weeks, each time with a reason that was marginally more plausible than the last. Once for a scheduled follow-up on the CV joint, reasonable. Once because she told herself she was driving through on the way to a site visit in Breckenridge. True, but she'd scheduled the site visit specifically so it would take her through Idaho Springs. Less defensible. The 3rd time, she just showed up on a Saturday morning and told the teenager at the counter that she wanted her winter tires rotated, which was a thing she'd Googled the night before. Each time, the interactions with Logan were brief and professionally bounded. He was courteous without being warm, attentive without being interested, and gave no indication that he was curious about her beyond the minimum information required to service her vehicle. She was not used to this. She was, professionally and personally, someone people were curious about. She'd spent years learning to manage the particular burden of being a young woman who ran a large company, which meant navigating between people who underestimated her and people who were fascinated by her as a category rather than a person. Logan Carter seemed genuinely, completely indifferent to what she did for a living. She found this, against all reason, a relief. It was Ava who made the first real opening. Charlotte arrived on a Saturday afternoon to pick up the car after the tire rotation, and found Ava at the counter working on what appeared to be a school art project. A large piece of drawing paper spread out, colored pencils arranged in a very specific order by shade, a half-finished image of something Charlotte couldn't yet identify. "What are you drawing?" Charlotte asked. Ava looked up. She'd remembered Charlotte from the first visit without making a production of it, which Charlotte had noticed. "The river," Ava said. "At night." Charlotte sat down. "Can I see?" Ava turned the paper toward her. It was a child's drawing, sure, but there was something about it that caught. The dark water rendered in overlapping blues and blacks, a sliver of moon through storm clouds, and 2 figures, one large, one smaller, on a gray bank. The larger figure was carrying the smaller one, and the smaller one had an arm raised, not drowning, but reaching. Charlotte felt the inside of her chest do something complicated. "Who are the people?" she asked carefully. Ava picked up a dark blue pencil and added another stroke to the water. "A person who fell in," she said, "and the person who went in after them." Charlotte looked at the drawing for another long moment. "It's really good, Ava." "I know," Ava said, matter-of-factly and without arrogance. "I'm going to put it on the wall." She was putting her jacket on to leave when Logan came in from the bay and stopped when he saw the drawing spread out on the counter. Something moved across his face, brief, difficult to read, and he looked at Ava. "You done with your homework?" he asked. "Yes, Dad." "All of it?" The math was easy. He made a sound that meant we'll discuss this and then looked at Charlotte. "She should have called you. Car's been ready for 40 minutes. "I was talking to Ava," Charlotte said. He looked at the drawing again. Looked at Charlotte. She held steady under it, and she wasn't entirely sure why she needed to hold steady, but she did. "I can charge you for the extra shop time," he said. His voice was dry, not hostile. "You can try," she said. Something that was not quite a smile moved at the corner of his mouth and was gone. He tore the service sheet off the clipboard and handed it to her. Their fingers didn't touch this time either, but it was closer. It was Ava who eventually said, around week 3 and with the bluntness that only an 8-year-old could weaponize completely by accident, "Charlotte, do you have kids?" They were sitting at the small table in the back room of the garage, the one with the microwave, where Charlotte had somehow ended up after Logan mentioned he and Ava were having dinner there tonight because he had a transmission job to finish. She'd said, without premeditation, "I'll grab something from the diner and eat here if you don't mind the company." And Logan had looked at her with the expression of a man who was trying to figure out something about a person and not quite getting there, and said, "Suit yourself." "No," Charlotte told Ava. "No kids." "How come?" "Ava," Logan said from across the table, a 2-syllable warning. "It's okay," Charlotte said. "I just haven't had time yet." Ava considered this with the philosophical weight she gave to most things. "My dad says that's not really true, that time isn't something you have, it's something you make." Charlotte looked at Logan, who was eating a microwave pasta without meeting her eyes and very evidently wishing he were somewhere else. "Your dad's probably right," Charlotte said. "He usually is," Ava said. "Except about movie night. He always picks things that are too old." "I pick classics," Logan said to his pasta. "You pick something from 1974. Chinatown is a masterpiece. There's no one in it under 50. Charlotte laughed. It came out genuine and slightly surprised, and Logan glanced up at the sound of it. Quick, instinctive, the way people look at something unexpected. What? He noticed the car on a Tuesday. A gray sedan, American make, parked on the street 2 buildings down from the garage. He'd have clocked it as unremarkable, except for the man inside it, who was doing a fairly convincing impression of someone on a phone call, but was positioned at an angle that kept the garage entrance in his peripheral view. Logan noticed these things the way some people notice weather, not by looking for them, but because something in the back of his brain had been trained to run a low-grade background scan for the last 20 years and had never fully learned to stop. The sedan was there again Thursday. Different driver, same vehicle, same angle. Friday morning, he walked past it on his way to get coffee and caught the window reflection without slowing. The driver had a radio on his belt clip, not a phone. Law enforcement, private security, or something with enough budget to use surveillance gear that wasn't visible on first pass. He went back to the garage and stood in the bay and thought about Charlotte Hayes for the first time not as the woman he'd pulled out of the river or the unexpected presence that had worked its way into the margins of his week, but as a variable in a situation that might have dimensions he hadn't mapped. He ran a search that night on his laptop at the kitchen table after Ava was asleep. Charlotte Hayes, CEO. Meridian merger. He read through the basics, the business story, the scale of it. 1,400 employees, multi-billion-dollar deal, a board of directors with names he didn't know, and photographs that all looked like variations on the same photograph. He dug a little further. Industry rumors, which he found in comment sections and financial forums, that he wasn't sure how to evaluate, but that pointed at something. Internal tensions around the Meridian deal. A faction on the board that had opposed it. A name. Victor Crane, board member and primary shareholder in a rival acquisition group, that appeared in 2 different places as someone who stood to lose significantly if the merger closed. The merger had closed. Logan sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house. Old houses in mountain towns made noise, the joists settling, the wind finding gaps, the furnace cycling. He knew all the sounds of this one. He'd been listening to them for 3 years. He thought about the guardrail that had given way. He pulled up the State Patrol accident report, which was public record. The report noted that the guardrail at mile marker 31 had shown what the investigator described as evidence of prior impact stress, possibly from a previous unreported collision. But the damage pattern, which was described in 2 clinical sentences, was something that Logan, who had spent years in environments where vehicles were used as weapons and structural compromise as a tactic, read very differently. The damage was too localized, too specific. The rail hadn't been compromised by a previous accident. It had been compromised on purpose, at exactly the point where a vehicle swerving to avoid an obstruction would be most likely to leave the road. He sat with that for a while. Then he closed the laptop and checked the locks on the doors, front, back, side entrance to the garage, and stood at the window and looked at the dark street until he was sure the sedan wasn't there tonight. He was not afraid. He'd stopped being afraid of specific threats sometime around his third deployment. What he felt instead was a familiar, cold clarity, the activation of something that had been dormant for 3 years and had apparently, underneath everything, been waiting. Someone had tried to kill Charlotte Hayes. They had either failed to confirm the kill and were waiting to know if she survived in a condition that constituted a problem for them, or they'd already decided the first attempt was insufficient. Either way, she was still in danger. And she was driving her gray Honda CR-V to a small garage in Idaho Springs twice a week and eating microwave pasta with his daughter like she had nowhere in particular to be, which meant that if she was still in danger, the garage was now part of her geography, which meant his daughter was now part of her geography. He picked up his phone. He stood there with it in his hand for a long moment, thinking through what he was about to do and what it would cost and whether he had the right to make that calculation for someone else. He put the phone down without calling. He needed more information first. He needed to know what he was actually looking at before he said anything to Charlotte Hayes, before he said anything to anyone. If he was wrong, he was a mechanic with a paranoid read on a routine accident and a tendency to see threats that no longer existed. If he was right, he needed to know how far the threat extended before he moved. He'd been wrong before. He'd also been right before. The cost of each kind of error was different, and he knew which one he could live with. He got his confirmation the following Monday, and he didn't go looking for it. He was working under the hood of a customer's Subaru, routine timing belt, nothing that needed much thought, when the back door of the garage, the one that opened onto the alley, rattled. Not the sound of wind, the specific sound of someone testing whether a door was locked. Logan set down his wrench. He straightened slowly and did not look at the door. He walked to the corner of the bay where the tool cabinet was and opened a drawer, not because he needed a tool, but because it put the cabinet between him and the door and gave him a sightline to the alley through the gap in the bay door. 2 men, both in dark coats. One of them had something in his right hand that he was keeping low and against his thigh, and it wasn't a clipboard. Logan picked up his phone from the cabinet shelf, typed a text to the teenager up front. Take your lunch break now. Walk to the diner. Don't come back for an hour. Don't ask why. He sent it. 30 seconds later, he heard the front door open and close. Then he picked up a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, 18 inches long, solid steel, heavier than it looked. And he waited. The back door opened on the second try. One of them was good with locks. Logan filed that away. The first man came in low and moving, and he was good, genuinely good. But he was expecting an empty garage, and what he got instead was Logan Carter closing the distance before he'd taken 2 steps, and the ratchet, and then the wall, in quick and businesslike succession. The second man in the doorway had enough time to register that the operation had gone wrong, but not enough time to do much about it. It lasted about 40 seconds. Logan stood in the center of the bay, breathing evenly, and looked at the 2 men on the floor. Neither of them was unconscious, but neither of them was getting up quickly either. He crouched next to the one who'd come in first. "Who sent you?" he asked. The man looked at him with the professional silence of someone who'd been trained not to answer that question. Logan nodded. He hadn't expected an answer. He patted down both men, found 2 phones and a folded piece of paper that had an address on it, Charlotte's office in Denver, and a notation that said confirmed delay, 72 hours, meaning someone knew she wasn't in Denver, meaning someone had been tracking her movements. He took both phones and the paper. He zip-tied both men to the structural column in the center of the bay. He had zip ties because he worked in a garage, and zip ties were one of those things. And he called 911 and reported a break-in attempt and 2 individuals being held at Carter & Son Automotive. Then he called a different number, a number he hadn't called in 3 years. It rang twice. "Carter?" said a voice that belonged to a man named Reyes, who was technically retired from naval special warfare and actually wasn't. "I need to know if anyone's been making inquiries," Logan said, "about a woman named Charlotte Hayes, corporate, Colorado-based." A pause. "Give me 6 hours." "Make it 4. He hung up. He stood in the bay with the 2 phones in his hand and the sound of sirens starting in the distance, and he thought about Ava, who would be on a school bus home in 4 hours. And he thought about Charlotte, who was probably in a meeting somewhere in Denver right now, completely unaware. He thought about the night on the bridge. The way he'd gone over the railing without deciding to, the decision already made somewhere below the level of thought. He'd told himself afterward that it was just training, just muscle memory, just the automatic behavior of someone who'd spent a decade responding to emergencies. Standing in the oil-smelling bay of his small garage with zip-tied mercenaries and a stolen phone and the cold clarity of a situation he hadn't asked for, Logan Carter acknowledged, quietly and without any sense of welcome, that it wasn't just training. Some people were put together in a way that meant they went over the railing. Not because they wanted to, not because they didn't know the cost, but because the alternative, standing at the guardrail and watching and doing nothing, was the one thing they genuinely didn't know how to do. He picked up his phone again and found the number Charlotte had given him 3 weeks ago when she'd left it with the front desk for scheduling purposes. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he typed, "We need to talk, not over the phone. Come to the garage tomorrow morning, come alone." He hit send. Her reply came back in 4 minutes. "I'll be there at 8. No questions, no hesitation," which told him something he hadn't known for certain before. That Charlotte Hayes, for all her composure and her carefully maintained daily life, already suspected that what happened on that bridge wasn't an accident. She'd just been waiting for someone else to say it first. Charlotte arrived at 7:58. Logan had the bay doors closed and the front office unlocked, and he was standing at the workbench with 2 cups of coffee when she came through the door. She was in dark clothes. Not deliberately tactical, just practical, the kind of woman who defaulted to neutral colors when she wasn't performing the CEO version of herself. She looked like she hadn't slept particularly well, which matched him. She looked at the 2 cups and picked one up without asking. "You going to tell me what happened yesterday?" she asked. "2 men tried to come through the back," Logan said. "They had your office address and a notation that suggested they knew you'd been away from Denver." Charlotte set the cup down. "You called the police?" "I called the police after I made sure they weren't going anywhere." He said it flatly, without editorializing. "Cops got here, took them in, booked for breaking and entering. Neither of them said anything useful to the responding officers." "They won't," she said, and the certainty in her voice told him what he'd already begun to suspect, that Charlotte Hayes had been thinking about this longer than she'd let on to anyone. "Professional hires don't talk." "No," he agreed. "They don't." She looked at him across the workbench. The morning light through the small window was gray and thin. "You know what they were. I know what they moved like." He picked up his own cup. "And I know that guardrail on the bridge wasn't compromised by a previous accident. The damage pattern was deliberate. Someone pre-weakened it at the specific point where a vehicle avoiding an obstruction would exit the road." She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone who'd been carrying a conclusion alone for several weeks and was now watching another person arrive at it independently, which is its own complicated kind of relief. "Victor Crane," she said. Logan nodded. "Os. She pote. His name came up when I started looking at the merger opposition. He lost $42 million when Meridian closed." She said it without satisfaction. Just a number, a fact, a thing that had consequences. He'd been maneuvering for 2 years to block it. I knew he was angry. I didn't think... She stopped, pressed her mouth into a line. "I should have thought." "You couldn't have known he'd go this far." "I'm supposed to know things like that. That's the job." She picked up the coffee again. Her hand was steady, which he noticed because it would have been understandable if it wasn't. "He's on the board. He has access to my schedule, my travel routes, the security protocols my team uses. He'd know exactly how to build a window." Logan let that sit for a moment. Then, "I've got a contact running deeper background on Crane, former colleague. I should hear back today." He paused. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight." "Okay. Is there anyone on your security team you trust completely?" "Not professionally, actually trust." She thought about it, which he respected. She didn't answer reflexively. "Desmond," she said finally. "He's been with me 6 years. He found you, actually, from the traffic footage." A slight pause. "He didn't want to. He thought I was being impractical." "Was he wrong?" Something moved in her expression. "Apparently not." "Call him," Logan said. "Tell him what we know and tell him to keep it between the 2 of you. Don't go to your board, don't go to the full security team, and don't go back to your apartment alone tonight." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "You think there's a timeline?" The notation on that paper said 72 hours from yesterday. Whatever they were delaying, they expected you to be back in Denver by then. He held her gaze. That gives us about 54 hours before someone decides the delay is over and adjusts the approach. She absorbed this without visible panic, which told him something important about her. Not that she was fearless, but that she'd developed the capacity to metabolize fear quickly and convert it into function. He'd known people like that in the field, and he'd known people who thought they were like that until the moment proved otherwise. Charlotte, he was fairly certain, was the first kind. "There's a charity gala tomorrow night," she said, "the Meridian Foundation launch. I'm the keynote. I can't cancel. It's been in the calendar for 3 months and there are 400 people attending. If I pull out, it signals something's wrong, and if Crane's watching..." "He'll know you know," Logan finished. "Yes." Logan set his cup down and looked at the wall for a moment. The gala was the worst possible variable, a fixed, public, well-advertised event that anyone with access to Charlotte's calendar would know about. A crowded venue, multiple entry points, guests and catering staff that were impossible to fully vet. If Crane's people wanted a second window, someone had probably already identified it. "Where's the venue?" he asked. "The Avalon Center, downtown Denver. It's a converted historic building, ballroom, multiple event floors, attached parking structure." She paused. "I know what you're thinking. Tell me." "That it's exactly the kind of environment that's difficult to secure and easy to exploit." Her voice was precise, almost clinical. "I ran the same calculation this morning in the car." And I still can't cancel." She said it without apology. "There are people at this gala who are there because of the foundation. Military families, specifically. People I made a commitment to. I'm not calling 400 people and telling them the event is off because I'm scared." Logan looked at her for a long moment. He thought about arguing. He thought about pointing out that being dead would also constitute a failure to follow through on her commitments. He didn't say either of those things. "Okay," he said. "Then we make it work." Reyes called at 11:17 with information that was worse than Logan had prepared for, and better organized than he'd hoped. Victor Crane had spent 8 years prior to his corporate career in positions that involved, without being specific in ways that showed up in public record, contract relationships with a security firm called Halcyon Group. Halcyon had been investigated twice by federal authorities for work that fell into the gray area between private security and hired facilitation of outcomes that various clients found desirable and various jurisdictions found criminal. Neither investigation had resulted in charges. Halcyon's principal, a man named Garrett Fossey, had a service record that Reyes described with characteristic understatement as colorful. "Fossey runs a tight team," Reyes said over the phone. Logan had stepped into the alley behind the garage alone. "Former military, some of them, mix of backgrounds. They're not street talent. The 2 they sent to your garage were probably mid-tier, experienced but expendable." "Fossey himself?" "That's the part you're not going to like." A pause. "Word I'm getting from people who would know is that Crane's running out of patience and running up his bill with Halcyon. When clients do that, Fossey sometimes takes personal interest in resolution. Cleaner outcomes, he calls it." "How many times has Fossey been on the operational end of something like this?" "That we know about?" 3. Another pause. None of the targets made it to a fourth conversation. Logan leaned against the cold brick wall of the garage and looked up at the canyon walls above town, white and still in the late morning light. He'd fought alongside men who were exceptional. He'd also fought against them, and the difference in what that required wasn't tactical. It was psychological. You couldn't fight someone who was very good the same way you fought someone who was merely dangerous. The margins were different. "Is he going to be at the gala?" Logan asked. "I can't confirm, but if Crane wants clean and he wants it in the next 48 hours, and he's spending the kind of money that suggests he's serious..." Reyes left the end of the sentence unfinished. He didn't need to finish it. "I need eyes on the venue," Logan said. "Can you..." "I'm in Albuquerque," Reyes said. "I can be in Denver in 7 hours, but that puts me there same night as the event." "That's fine. I'll do the advance work this afternoon. I need you there for the event itself." He thought for a moment. "And Reyes, I need you to not ask me too many questions about this." A short silence. Carter, you've been out for 3 years. I know. You got a kid. I know that too. This woman worth the math? Logan thought about Ava's drawing, the two figures on the gray bank, one reaching. He thought about Charlotte picking up the coffee cup without asking, like she'd been coming here long enough not to need permission. He thought about 54 hours and a fixed venue and a man named Fosse who had a record of clean resolutions. She didn't do anything, Logan said. She built something real. She had someone try to take her out because of it, and she's still standing at a podium tomorrow night for people who need her to be there. That's... He stopped. Yeah, she's worth the math. Another silence, longer. 7 hours, Reyes said, and hung up. Charlotte sent Ava to stay with the family of her closest school friend, a woman named Dana, whose husband had known Logan for years and didn't ask questions. And Logan drove to Denver that afternoon while Charlotte attended a pre-gala briefing at her office, accompanied by Desmond, who had been read in and had taken the information with the grim composure of someone who was angry at himself for not having seen it sooner. Logan walked to the Avalon Center as a vendor delivery. He'd called in a favor with a florist he barely knew, explained exactly nothing, and borrowed a logoed jacket in exchange for a promise he'd make good on somehow. The building was what Charlotte had described, a converted early 20th century ballroom, 3 stories, the main event space on the second floor, a mezzanine above it, attached parking structure to the east. 6 entry points he could identify. Staff entrance in the rear that opened onto a service corridor running the length of the building. He spent 2 hours in the building. He found the weak points. There were 4 serious ones and 2 that only looked serious, and he mapped them against what he knew about Fosse's documented operational patterns, which Reyes had sent him in a text file that Logan read in a stairwell with his back to the wall. Fosse liked controlled chaos. Events, concerts, crowds. The noise and movement provided cover and confusion, and if something went wrong, you had 400 witnesses who'd all seen something different and couldn't agree on any of it. He'd worked 2 previous operations in event venues, according to what Reyes could document. In both cases, the critical action happened in a secondary space, not the main floor, not where the target was visible and surrounded by people, but in a corridor, an exit, a private room, during a transition. Charlotte would be on the main floor for most of the evening. The vulnerable window was the movement between the main floor and the speaker's staging area, and the movement from the staging area to the exit at the close of the event. 2 transitions, 2 windows. Logan photographed the staging corridor with his phone, sent the images to Reyes, and walked back through the building at the pace of a man who belonged there, which was slower and more deliberate than the pace of a man who was in a hurry and therefore visible. In the lobby on his way out, he passed a tall man in a building manager's lanyard who looked at Logan with the specific quality of attention that meant he was cataloging rather than simply noticing. Logan met his eyes briefly and moved on. He turned the corner into the main corridor, found a maintenance alcove, and waited. The man in the lanyard walked past the corridor and entrance 30 seconds later, not toward any particular destination, just moving, orienting. Logan took the service stairs back to the delivery level and left through the rear entrance and stood on the sidewalk in the cold Denver afternoon and thought, they're already inside. The gala started at 7. Charlotte wore dark blue, not quite navy, something with more warmth in it, and her hair up, and she moved through the arriving crowd with the practiced ease of someone who'd been performing composure at public events since her mid-20s. She greeted people by name, remembered details about their children and their projects, and laughed in the right places at the right volume. Desmond was 12 feet away, never less. In her earpiece was a discreet receiver tuned to the frequency Logan and Reyes were using. Logan was in the building by 5:30 via a second borrowed access through the catering company. Reyes had arrived in Denver at 4, changed in a parking garage bathroom, and was covering the exterior and the parking structure. They'd worked together long enough that the communication between them was economical almost to the point of silence. Short confirmations, position updates, anomalies flagged without editorial. Mezzanine, South End, Logan said quietly into the mic clipped inside his jacket collar. Man in a gray suit, been stationary for 20 minutes, hasn't looked at the event once. I've got a second one, Reyes said through his earpiece from outside. Street level, east side of the parking structure. He's not parking. How many total, you think? Fosse runs fours and sixes. My guess is 6. You've got 2 on the inside. I've got 1 out here. That's 3 accounted for. 3 more somewhere. Logan moved along the wall of the mezzanine slowly, a glass of water in his hand, the posture of someone between conversations. He scanned. The crowd was dense on the main floor below. The Foundation's donor base, corporate partners, several dozen military families in their best clothes, children running between adult legs near the back of the room. Charlotte was at the center of it, working the room the way she'd been doing this all her life. He heard her laugh at something, genuine, carrying up to the mezzanine, and it was such an ordinary sound in the middle of what he was doing that it almost broke his concentration. Almost. "Charlotte," he said quietly, just barely above a whisper. In her earpiece, she'd hear it clearly. "Don't change anything you're doing. I need you to tell me if anyone has asked to meet you privately tonight. A board member, a donor, anyone." A beat. Then her voice, easy and social, directed at whoever was in front of her. "Absolutely. Let me get back to you on that by the end of the week." And then, lower, barely moving her lips, "Richard Pell, board member, asked me to step into the private dining room on the 3rd floor during the cocktail hour for a quick conversation about the Foundation governance structure." Richard Pell. Logan pulled up the mental file he'd built over the past 48 hours. Pell was Crane's longest-standing board ally. The ask, private room, upper floor, away from the crowd, was exactly what Fosse's pattern suggested. "Don't go," Logan said. "Tell him you'll connect later. Be warm about it." A pause. "Understood." He found the 3rd man inside the building at 8:15, near the service entrance to the 3rd floor private dining room, dressed in kitchen whites that didn't fit right across the shoulders, which was the tell, because Fosse hired former military and former military-built muscle in specific places and cheap kitchen whites never accounted for it. He updated Reyes. Reyes confirmed a 4th man had moved from the parking structure to the building's rear entrance. The net was tightening, which meant the timeline was moving up, which meant something had changed. "They know the private room approach isn't going to work," Logan said quietly, moving toward the stairs. "They're going to move to a public exit and force a transition. How do you want to play it?" "Desmond needs to get her out of the main room now, not the front exit. The service corridor on the east side goes to a loading bay that connects to the parking structure lower level. If they're moving their asset from the structure into the building, that corridor becomes a pinch point. I can block the structure entrance." "Do it." And Reyes, "Yeah." "Fosse, if he's here, he's on Crane's direct instruction and he's the closer. Don't let him get into the building." "Working on it." Logan descended the east stairwell quickly and found Desmond at the base of it 2 minutes later. He'd relayed the corridor instructions through Charlotte's earpiece, and Desmond had moved without hesitation, which confirmed Logan's assessment of the man. "She's at the podium in 6 minutes, Desmond said. "They're not going to move on her in front of 400 people. "They don't have to move on her here," Logan said. "They need to move her. Get the crowd thinned because of disruption, and in the confusion she's suddenly 3 corridors away, and there's a gun in her back, and the whole thing plays as a medical emergency or a security situation that nobody has clear footage of." He looked at Desmond. "Has anyone on the staff reported a fire alarm test tonight?" Desmond's jaw tightened. "No." "Then we have about 4 minutes. The alarm went off at 8:22. Not the building's main alarm, Sicht, a secondary panel on the 3rd floor, which produced a localized alert through the event venue's in-house system, the kind that caused staff to begin guiding guests toward exits without triggering a full building evacuation. Exactly the controlled chaos Fosse preferred, exactly the kind of disruption that was difficult to explain in advance and impossible to predict from the outside. The main floor became movement, polite, organized movement, because these were Denver's donor class, and they were accustomed to following instructions at events. But movement nonetheless. 400 people redirecting toward 4 exit routes. The ambient noise level spiked. Visual lines collapsed. Charlotte's earpiece, "Logan." "I've got you," he said. "Desmond is at your 6. Do not go toward the main exits. There's a door to your left marked staff. Go through it, take the stairwell down. Desmond knows where." "There's a man between me and that door," she said, her voice absolutely level. "He's been working his way toward me since the alarm." Logan was already moving through the crowd from the east side, not pushing, angling, the way you move through bodies when you need to cover ground without creating a wake. He could see her across the floor, the dark blue dress, the composed line of her shoulders, and the man Desmond had flagged, gray suit, now 6 feet from her and closing with the deliberate directional intent of someone who wasn't interested in an exit. Logan got there in 12 seconds. He put himself between Charlotte and the man without any announcement, and the man stopped and looked at him, and Logan looked back. And there was a moment that had no sound in it at all, despite the alarms and the crowd and the everything. "Wrong room," Logan said quietly. The man made a decision. He reached, and Logan caught the wrist, controlled the arm, walked him backward into a pillar, in a motion that was efficient and precise, and over before anyone in the surrounding crowd had processed that it wasn't two men having a disagreement about directions. The man hit the pillar, the breath went out of him, and Logan had him pinned with his wrist locked at an angle that made further movement an extremely poor option. "Tell Fossey the window's closed," Logan said, low and direct, right at his ear. "Tell him Charlotte Hayes walks out of this building tonight, and tell Victor Crane that whatever he thought he was going to buy himself, the price just went up beyond what he can afford." He released the man, stepped back, and found Charlotte at his shoulder. She'd moved up behind him during the 30 seconds it took, Desmond on her other side, and she was looking at Logan with an expression that was not fear and not relief, and not quite anything that had a clean name. "Staff door," Logan said. They went. Each time. The service corridor was fluorescent lit and concrete floored and smelled like the underside of an event. Grease and cleaning product and the particular staleness of recycled building air. Their footsteps were too loud. Charlotte had lost one heel somewhere in the transition and was walking at a slight angle, which she'd corrected for and wasn't mentioning. Reyes met them at the loading bay level, coming in from the parking structure entrance. He was a compact man, dark-haired, with the economy of movement that came from operating in small spaces for a long time. He looked at Logan and said, "Two down on the exterior. Fossey wasn't with them." "He sent the B team," Logan said. "Yeah, and I think I know why." Reyes handed him his phone. On the screen was a photograph taken 20 minutes ago from the parking structure's upper level. A man standing at a vehicle, talking on a phone. Well-dressed, older, silver-haired, watching the building's main entrance. "That's Crane," Charlotte said from beside Logan. She said it with the particular flatness of someone identifying something they'd suspected for weeks and are now looking at in a photograph in a parking garage and processing the reality of it. "He's here." "He wanted to watch," Reyes said. "That's a control thing. Clients who want to watch the delivery. It's a specific type." "He's also a witness," Logan said, "to his own operation." He looked at Desmond. "If we can get law enforcement here fast enough." "I've been on the phone with my contact at Denver PD for the last 8 minutes, Desmond said quietly. He had his phone in one hand and the expression of a man who had realized he'd underestimated the situation, but was not going to let that happen twice. "They're 90 seconds out." Logan looked at Charlotte. She was looking at the photograph on Reyes's phone. The expression on her face was hard to read. Not anger exactly. Something colder and more considered than anger. "He was at the board meeting when we signed the Meridian paperwork," she said. "He shook my hand." A pause. "He shook my hand and told me it was a good deal for the company." Nobody said anything. "Let's go up," she said. The police arrived in the parking structure with enough presence that Crane, who had apparently not planned for the possibility that his operation would fold in under 3 hours, made the error of attempting to leave on foot, which was how he ended up in the custody of 2 officers near the structure's stairwell exit, with his phone still in his hand and a text conversation open that his own attorney would spend the next 6 months trying to suppress. Logan watched it from the loading bay entrance. He was watching it from a distance, and he had his jacket collar up, and he was standing in the shadow of the bay door, because standing in the light while law enforcement sorted out a crime scene was a habit he'd broken himself of years ago and had no interest in reacquiring. Charlotte was on the structure's second level with Desmond and 2 officers, giving a statement. He could see her from where he stood, the dark blue dress, the missing heel, her hands moving precisely as she talked. She was controlled and specific, and probably devastating as an eyewitness because she was the kind of person who noticed details and retained them and communicated them without decoration. He thought about leaving. It was a genuine consideration. The situation was contained, Crane was in custody, Reyes was handling the exterior handoff to law enforcement, and Desmond was capable of managing everything that needed managing for the rest of the night. Logan Carter had a truck in a public garage 2 blocks away and a daughter at Dana's house who'd need picking up in the morning. He thought about leaving. He didn't leave. Reyes came and stood next to him after a few minutes. They looked at the parking structure in silence for a while. "You good?" Reyes asked. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've got that thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you're fine, but your jaw is doing what it does." Reyes looked at him sideways. "Same thing it did in Kandahar that time you said you were fine and then put 3 guys through a wall. That was different." "Yeah, it's always different." Reyes glanced toward Charlotte on the second level. "She seems solid." "She is." "You gonna do something about that?" Logan looked at him. "I'm just asking," Reyes said, with the mildness of a man who was not just asking. "Go handle the exterior," Logan said. Reyes went, not without a particular quality of silence that communicated amusement. Charlotte came down from the second level 20 minutes later. She found Logan at the loading bay entrance and stopped a few feet away from him, and they looked at each other in the flat industrial light of the parking structure with the sound of police radio and the distant noise of a gala crowd being redirected and explained to in the background. Her hair had come half down during the service corridor transit. She hadn't fixed it. One shoe was still missing its heel, and she was standing with her weight slightly adjusted. She looked exhausted and alert simultaneously, which was the specific combination that people who'd run on adrenaline for several hours produced. "Crane's in custody," she said. "I saw. Fosse's people are. Reyes is handling it with the officers." She nodded. She looked down for a moment at her hands. Then she looked up. "You didn't have to come tonight," she said. "I know." "This wasn't your problem." "Charlotte." He said her name the same way he'd said it maybe twice before. Not often, because he didn't use people's names unless he meant to. "I know." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something he hadn't expected. She laughed, short and genuine and slightly broken at the edges. The laugh of someone who's been holding it together for a long time and has just been given brief permission to stop. "I'm standing in a parking garage with one broken heel," she said, "and I just watched the man who tried to kill me get put in a police car, and I still have to figure out what I'm going to say to 400 people about why the fire alarm went off during the cocktail hour." She pressed the heel of her hand briefly to her forehead, where the scar from the bridge was almost faded now. "This is the strangest night of my entire life." "Second strangest," Logan said. She looked at him. "Bridge was worse," he said. She laughed again, and this time it was more fully itself. She pressed her lips together after it, like she was containing something, and she looked at him with an expression that wasn't complicated at all, actually. It was very simple, and it was the look of someone who has decided to stop pretending they don't know what they know. "Thank you," she said, for the second time. "You're going to stop needing rescuing eventually," he said. "I'm going to hold you to that." She walked back toward the building entrance, steadier than anyone had a right to be after the night she'd just had, and Logan watched her go, and the thing in his chest that had been tight for hours. Maybe longer than that. Maybe since a bridge railing gave way on a mountain road in December and changed the shape of whatever came next. Eased, slightly, in the way that things ease when the immediate crisis is past, and what remains is the rest of it, whatever the rest of it turned out to be. He picked up his phone, texted Dana's number. "Everything fine. I'll pick her up in the morning." Then he put his jacket collar back down and walked out of the parking structure into the cold Denver night, where the stars were out and the air smelled like snow that hadn't fallen yet, and the city ran on around him indifferent and bright, and entirely unaware that anything had happened at all. The aftermath of the gala took 3 days to fully surface, and none of it was clean. Victor Crane's attorney filed a motion to suppress the text conversation within 48 hours of the arrest, which was expected. What wasn't expected, or what Charlotte had hoped wouldn't happen, which wasn't the same thing, was the speed with which it leaked to the financial press. By Thursday morning, the story was on the front page of 2 business publications and the ticker of 3 cable news networks, framed in the particular way that financial scandals get framed. As a story about corporate governance and board oversight and the systemic vulnerabilities of merger negotiations, which was accurate in the way that describing a house fire as a ventilation problem is technically accurate. Charlotte spent Thursday in back-to-back sessions with her legal team, her communications director, 3 members of the newly restructured board, and a federal investigator named Holt, who was quiet and thorough and asked questions that were several layers deeper than they appeared on the surface. She answered all of them. She was good at this. The controlled presentation of facts, the maintenance of composure under examination. She'd been doing versions of it since she was 23 years old, and people twice her age had been asking her to prove she belonged in rooms she'd built herself. What she was less good at, it turned out, was the part that came after. She got back to her apartment at 9:17 Thursday night, sat down on the couch still in her work clothes, and found that she couldn't make herself stand back up. Not immediately. The apartment was quiet in the specific way that apartments are quiet when you've been filling your life with noise for long enough that the absence of it becomes its own presence. She'd lived alone for 4 years and had never particularly minded it. She minded it now, which was new information about herself that she filed away and didn't immediately examine. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She picked it up again. She called the garage. It rang 4 times, which was how long it took Logan to get from wherever he was in the building to the desk phone that he still used because, as he'd explained to her once in a tone that suggested this was not a point he was going to negotiate, cell signal in the canyon was unreliable and customers needed to be able to reach him. "Carter's," he said. "It's Charlotte." A beat. "I know, Ray put your number in the phone months ago." A pause in which she could hear something metallic in the background, a tool being set down. "You doing okay?" "I'm sitting on my couch in yesterday's clothes," she said, "and I can't figure out what to do next, which is not something that usually happens to me." "Yeah," he said. "That's the come down. It happens after." He said it simply, without clinical distance, the way someone says something they know from experience rather than from theory. "Does it go away?" "Mostly. Takes a day or 2. A pause. "Have you eaten anything?" She thought about it. "I had half a sandwich around noon." "That's not eating." She heard him moving. "There's a place in Idaho Springs that does delivery to Denver on Thursday nights. It's a whole thing. Don't ask. You want me to send something?" The offer was so practical and so entirely devoid of any attempt to make it more than it was that she felt something in her chest loosen unexpectedly. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." He sounded slightly impatient, which she'd come to understand was his version of affection. "What do you want?" "Whatever you'd order." "You're not a picky eater?" "I spent my 20s eating at my desk at 11 p.m. I'll eat whatever is hot and arrives within the hour." "Okay." She could hear him writing something down. "Charlotte." His voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more direct. "The legal piece is going to work out. Crane's texts are recoverable regardless of what his attorney files. The federal investigator will have already imaged the device. You know that, right?" "I know that," she said. "I know all of it. She stopped. "I trusted him. Not liked him. I never particularly liked Victor Crane, but trusted professionally. He was on the board when I took over the company. He'd been there 9 years. I built decisions on the assumption that the people around me were operating in good faith, and She pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose. "He shook my hand, Logan." There was a silence that wasn't empty. The kind of silence that someone on the other end of a phone call produces when they're choosing what to say rather than just filling space. "People who do things like that," he said finally, "they count on exactly that. On you being the kind of person who builds on good faith. It's not a flaw in you, it's a flaw in them." A beat. "And for what it's worth, you were right about the merger. The company's structurally sound, the employees are still employed, and the man who tried to stop it by killing you is in a federal holding facility. You won." Charlotte looked at the ceiling. "You're bad at the soft version of comfort." "I know. It's still helping." "Good." She heard him put the receiver down briefly, then back. Food's on its way. Get out of the work clothes. He hung up before she could respond, which was also, she was learning, characteristic. Tut. Logan was in surgery for 2 hours and 40 minutes. That part came later, 4 days after the gala, on a Monday morning that started with a phone call from Reyes, who had stayed in Denver to help the federal investigators map the Halcyon network and had been monitoring channels that Logan didn't have access to from Idaho Springs. Fosse, Reyes said when Logan picked up. It was 6 a.m. and Logan was already in the garage, had been since 5:30. He wasn't at the gala because he was running a parallel operation. Crane hedged. If the gala approach failed, Fosse had a secondary target, the evidence chain. Specifically the laptop Crane used to communicate with Halcyon prior to the bridge operation. Where's the laptop? Logan asked. Charlotte's company IT department. They pulled it from Crane's board credentials access 3 days ago. Standard legal hold. It's at the Meridian offices in Denver. Fosse knows this. Logan was already taking off his work apron. When? My contact says Fosse was seen near the Meridian building last night. The federal investigator has people there, but it's a federal building process, and Fosse has been inside corporate security environments before and knows the gaps. Logan grabbed his keys. Charlotte's in Denver today. I know. That's why I called you and not the investigator. He drove to Denver at speeds that the F-250 was theoretically capable of, but had not been asked to produce in some time. He called Charlotte on the way, on Bluetooth, and she picked up on the second ring from what sounded like a conference room. I need you to leave the building, he said. Right now. Take Desmond, go to the parking structure, use the east exit, not the main lobby. Logan, Charlotte. His voice had the quality it got when he was done discussing. The man who wasn't at the gala is currently in proximity to your building, and there's evidence on your company's servers he needs destroyed. You're the only person in that building who can authorize an emergency lockdown of the digital archive, and you being present makes you a variable in whatever he's planning. A short silence, then quieter, away from whoever else was in the room. How long do I have? I don't know. Reyes thinks he moved last night. That means he's either inside already or he's positioning. I'll call Desmond. Do it now. Don't take the elevator. Call me when you're in the car. He heard her say something to the room, professional, unhurried, the executive managing a scheduling conflict, and then the sound of movement, a door, and her voice back in his ear. Going to Desmond now. Good. Logan? A pause. Be careful getting here. He didn't respond to that. He pressed the accelerator and watched the canyon walls open into the foothills, and the foothills flatten into the Denver metro. And he thought about a man named Garrett Fosse, who had a record of clean resolutions, and who was, by all available evidence, very good at what he did. He found Fosse on the 4th floor of the Meridian building's parking structure. Not because he was lucky. Because he'd spent 20 minutes in the structure identifying where he'd position himself if he were Fosse. Not at Charlotte's office level, not at building security, but at the vehicle level, controlling the exit, because Fosse was smart enough to know that the office was now too exposed, and the vehicle was where isolation became possible. You didn't need to be inside someone's building if you had them in a parking structure with limited exits and a silenced weapon and the particular confidence of a man who'd done this several times. Charlotte and Desmond were on level 2. Logan knew this because Desmond had sent him a pin and Logan had come in through the stairwell on the west side, which was the side away from where Fosse's vehicle, a rental, Colorado plates, the kind of invisible gray that rental cars always were, was positioned on level 4 with sightlines to the elevator bank. The thing about confronting someone who was genuinely skilled was that you didn't do it the way movies suggested. You didn't announce yourself. You didn't negotiate from across a parking structure. You collapsed the distance as fast as possible, and you made the engagement happen on your terms rather than his, because his terms involved a firearm and distance, and your terms, if you were Logan Carter, involved neither of those things. He came off the stairwell fast and low, and Fosse, who was, as advertised, good, registered the threat and turned and fired in a sequence that was faster than most people's would have been. Logan had already moved off the line. The bullet went through the space he'd occupied and hit concrete, and the sound of it was enormous in the enclosed structure. And then they were close enough that the weapon became a liability rather than an advantage. And what happened in the next 40 seconds was the kind of thing that doesn't have clean narration because it's not clean. It's two trained people in a concrete space trying to control each other, and the floor is oil-stained, and there's a support column that changes the geometry, and neither of them is operating without cost. Logan took a hit to his left side. Fosse had a blade, secondary weapon, and got it out faster than Logan had planned for, and it went into the space between his ribs and the top of his hip on the left side. And it was the kind of pain that arrives fully a second after the event, which meant he had approximately 1 second of unimpaired function, and he used it completely. Fosse went down. Logan put him down and kept him down and sat back against the support column with one hand on his left side and the sound of his own breathing very loud, and the overhead fluorescence flickering the way parking structure lights always flickered, and he thought with some detachment that the amount of warmth he was feeling at his left side was probably more than preferable. He heard footsteps on the stairwell. Carter, Reyes's voice, then Reyes himself coming around the column, taking in the scene with the rapid assessment of someone who'd seen versions of it before. His eyes went to Logan's side and his jaw set. "I'm okay," Logan said. "You say that every time." "Every time I mean it. Every time you're wrong." Reyes was already on his phone calling it in while he moved toward Fosse and confirmed the situation with a professional brevity and then crouched next to Logan. "How deep?" "Not deep enough to matter." "You're a terrible judge of that." He put his hand out. "Give me your hand, put pressure on it, and don't move." "Desmond and Charlotte?" "Desmond has her. They're in the car." Reyes met his eyes. "They're fine. Hold still." Logan held still, which was easier than he'd have expected because the adrenaline was metabolizing fast and the warmth at his side was becoming something less comfortable. He looked up at the flickering fluorescent above him and thought about the river, how cold it had been, how clear the decision had been even in the cold, and how none of the subsequent decisions had felt as clean as that first one, and yet here he was, having made all of them. He heard Charlotte's voice in the stairwell before he saw her. "I understand, Desmond. I heard you, but—" And then she was around the column, and she stopped and looked at him, and the expression on her face was one he hadn't seen on her before. Not the composure, not the professional steadiness, not even the stripped-down directness that was the version of her he'd come to know. This was something under all of that, something that didn't have a performance in it. "Sit down," Logan said. "I'm okay." "You're bleeding." "It's managed. Reyes has it." "Reyes is on the phone." "Then I have it." He met her eyes. "Charlotte?" "I'm okay. Sit down." She didn't sit down. She came to where he was and sat on the concrete next to him, close enough that her shoulder was against his, and she put her hand over his hand that was holding pressure on his side, and she kept it there, and she didn't say anything else. Neither did he. The ambulance arrived in 6 minutes. He was in surgery for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The blade had missed anything critical. The ER surgeon, a young woman with an unhurried voice who reminded Logan faintly of his daughter in the way she approached problems, told him this with the directness of someone who was used to patients needing real information rather than comfort. 2 ribs had deflected the angle. He'd have significant bruising, 6 weeks of reduced activity, and a scar that would join the existing collection. Charlotte was in the surgical waiting room for all 2 hours and 40 minutes. Logan knew this not because he was conscious for it, he wasn't, general anesthesia being what it is, but because she was the first thing he saw when he came around in recovery, sitting in the chair next to the bed with her work jacket folded over her knees and a cup of cold hospital coffee on the table beside her. She looked up when he moved. "Hi," she said. "You didn't have to stay," he said. His voice came out rough and dry. "I know I didn't have to." She handed him a cup of water from the table. It was the first thing she'd said to him 2 months ago at the garage, essentially, and he recognized it, and so did she. And the small understanding that passed between them about that was the kind of thing that didn't need to be stated. "How long?" he asked. 3 hours. You've been out of surgery for about 40 minutes. She paused. "Ava's on her way. Dana's driving her." "You called Dana?" "I called the number you left at the garage as your emergency contact, yes." She held his gaze. She said, and I'm quoting, that you had better be genuinely injured and not just trying to get out of Ava's school science fair. Logan closed his eyes briefly. Next Thursday. I told her you'd be there. I don't know if I'll... You'll be there, Charlotte said. It wasn't aggressive, it was just certain, the way she was certain about things she'd decided. I'll drive you if I have to. He looked at her. She was still in what she'd been wearing at the office that morning. Dark pants, a light blue top that now had a small rust-colored smear near the cuff that she either hadn't noticed or had decided not to address. She looked tired in the way that people look tired when they've been running on resolve for several hours, and it's only now draining off. Her hair had come partially loose again, the way it did in situations. He'd noticed this, that her hair came down when things got real, like the performance of composed CEO required a certain tension, and actual events cut the line. Thank you, he said. For what? For being here. She looked at him directly. Where else would I be? He didn't answer that. He wasn't sure he had an answer that was right-sized for the question. The recovery room was quiet around them. The particular hushed efficiency of a hospital at work, the beep of the monitor, the distant sound of a hallway. The investigator called while you were in surgery, Charlotte said after a moment. Fossey is in custody. His team, the ones Reyes flagged and handed to federal authorities, are cooperating to reduce their exposure. Crane's attorney filed 3 more motions this morning, and the judge denied all 3. She paused. The laptop is secure. The evidence chain is intact. Good. It's over, she said. The legal process will take time, but She found the word. The threat is over. Yeah. He looked at the ceiling. Good. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Logan, I want to ask you something. Okay. And I want you to actually answer it, not manage it. He looked at her sideways. Okay. Why did you come this morning? You could have called Desmond. You could have called the federal investigator. You had Reyes's number. She held his gaze steadily. You drove 2 hours and walked into a parking structure alone to find a man with a professional record because... She stopped. Why? It was a fair question. It was the most direct question anyone had asked him in several years. He thought about giving her the tactical answer, that Reyes had intel, that the federal response time was uncertain, that the geography of the structure required someone who'd already walked it, all of which was true. He said, because it was you. Charlotte didn't look away. I don't do this anymore, he said. This specific thing. I walked away from it when Sarah died because I was done with it, and because Ava needed someone who wasn't still half inside an operation, and I meant it, 3 years of meaning it. He paused. And then there was a bridge railing in a snowstorm, and I went over it, and I've been trying to figure out ever since whether that was training or something else. What did you figure out? That it was something else. He said it flatly, not like a confession, just like a fact that had finally resolved itself into clarity. You walked into the garage 3 weeks after the crash on the flimsiest excuse I've ever heard from someone who owns a car that actually needed a CV joint, and you had coffee from the machine without making a face, and you talked to my daughter about her drawing like she was a person and not a child, and He stopped. I didn't want anything to happen to you, not because I'm trained for that, because it was you specifically. The room was very quiet. That was more than you usually say in a single conversation, Charlotte said. I'm on painkillers. Should I not count it? It's still true. He looked at the ceiling again. You can count it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, when I was in that river, I was scared. I don't remember most of it, but I remember the scared part. And then I remember a hand on my wrist that was certain, in a way that I've been thinking about for 3 months. She paused. I told myself I went to the garage because I needed to understand the kind of person who does what you did, but I already understood it by the time I got there. I understood it when I read the file. Then why did you come? Because I wanted to see if the certainty was just a crisis thing, or if it was... She stopped. If it was the actual person, Logan said. Yes. And? A beat. It's the actual person. From down the hallway came the sound of quick footsteps, the kind of footsteps made by a child who has been told to walk, but has decided that the instruction doesn't apply to the specific corridor outside a hospital recovery room. The door opened and Ava was there, backpack still on, purple coat with the iron-on tape at the elbow, looking at her father in the hospital bed with her mother's eyes wide and immediate and already reading. "You got hurt," she said. "A little," Logan said. "More than a little." She came to the side of the bed that wasn't Charlotte's side and took his hand, small fingers around his, the grip of it very certain. "Ray told me what happened. He heard from Reyes. Ray's 12. He's 14, and he told me." She looked at Charlotte. "Is he going to be okay?" "He's going to be completely fine," Charlotte said. 6 weeks and he'll be back in the garage." Ava looked back at her father. "Charlotte stayed the whole time," she said, as if reporting something he might not have known. "I know," Logan said. "I told Dana that was probably going to happen," Ava said, in the tone of someone whose predictions have been validated. She climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed, fitting herself into the space that didn't have tubes or monitors, with the assurance of a child who has decided that the rules about hospital beds don't apply to her either. Logan put his arm around her and she settled against his right side, away from the injury, with an instinctive precision that made him think she'd understood the geography of the situation more completely than she'd let on. "You were scared," she said. It wasn't a question. "A little," he said again. "It's okay to be scared." She said it with the slightly formal gravity of a child repeating something she'd been told and had decided to believe. "You told me that." He had told her that. Several times, in several contexts. He hadn't known she was going to deploy it in a hospital recovery room, but in retrospect it was exactly the kind of thing Ava would deploy in exactly this setting. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He stayed in the hospital overnight and came home the following afternoon. Charlotte drove. She'd offered with the matter-of-fact practicality that had become her characteristic mode of helping, which was to make it logistically obvious rather than emotionally fraught. The F-250 stayed in Denver until Reyes drove it back 2 days later. The recovery was not, as Logan had known it would not be, clean. The first 4 days were bad in the particular way of rib injuries, which is to say that breathing was an unpleasant activity and sleeping was worse. He'd been hurt before, several times, in contexts that ranged from training to actual operational damage, and he'd always been alone for the recovery part, which had suited him, because being hurt in front of people required a specific kind of surrender he'd never been comfortable with. Charlotte came on the second day with food from a place she'd found in Idaho Springs that was not the garage microwave or the diner and was better than both. She sat at his kitchen table and worked from her laptop while he slept, which she hadn't asked permission to do and which he found upon waking that he didn't mind. Ava came home from school, saw Charlotte at the kitchen table with her laptop, said hi, with the ease of someone who'd been expecting this, and went to do her homework at the other end of the table. Logan watched this from the hallway, where he'd come to get water, and paused, and he stood there long enough that Charlotte looked up and saw him. "You should be in bed," she said. "I was in bed. For 4 hours, which is not... I don't sleep during the day." "You're recovering from surgery." "I'm aware of that." Ava looked up from her homework. "He won't sleep during the day," she told Charlotte, with the tone of someone providing useful background. "I've tried. He just reads or stares at the ceiling." "What does he read?" "History, sometimes military stuff. Once he read the whole manual for the truck engine, but I don't think that counts." Charlotte looked at Logan. "The truck manual. It had information I needed." "About your own truck." "That you'd rebuilt yourself," Ava added helpfully. "I was checking something," Logan said, with the dignity of a man losing an argument he hadn't agreed to enter. Charlotte turned back to her laptop, and the corner of her mouth was doing the thing it did when she was containing something. "Go sit down somewhere that isn't bed if the bed isn't working. I brought soup. It's on the stove." He got the soup. He sat in the chair by the window that looked out on the canyon, and he ate. And the kitchen was warm, and the table had 2 people doing quiet work at it, and the house sounded like something it hadn't sounded like in 3 years. He didn't examine it directly. He just let it be there. On the 5th day, Ava asked him something. She asked it in the morning before school, while he was at the kitchen counter trying to make coffee left-handed because his right side was still unreasonably unhappy about being involved in anything. She was eating cereal and watching him struggle with the coffee maker with the particular patience of a child who has decided to observe a situation before intervening. "Dad," she said. "Do you like Charlotte?" He looked at her. She was 7 spoonfuls into her cereal and her backpack was by the door, and she was wearing the purple coat and asking him this the way she asked him most things. Directly, without strategic framing, because she had not yet learned that people usually circled questions before landing on them. "Yes," he said, like, as a friend, or, "Ava, I'm just asking. I know you're just asking." "Because she stayed the whole time at the hospital," Ava said, "and she came yesterday, and the day before she texted me to ask if you were eating." She pointed her spoon at him. "Were you eating?" "Yes." "She didn't think so." "I was eating." "Okay." She went back to her cereal. Then, after a moment, "I think you should tell her." "Tell her what?" She gave him a look that was so precisely his own expression reflected back at him. The slight impatience, the "we both know what I mean," that he had to look away. "She's not going to be around forever just because she's being nice," Ava said, with the unsentimental clarity of a child who has thought about this more than anyone knew. "People have their own lives. If you want her to be part of ours, you should probably say something, because she's not going to know unless you tell her, and you're not—" She searched for the word. "You're not obvious about stuff." This was the most specific and accurate assessment anyone had made of Logan Carter in recent memory, and it had been delivered by an 8-year-old over cereal at 7 in the morning. "When did you get like this?" he asked. "I've always been like this," Ava said. "You just don't notice because you're not obvious about stuff." The bus came 8 minutes later, and she grabbed her backpack and her coat and went, leaving Logan at the kitchen counter with the coffee he'd finally managed to make and his daughter's words sitting in the room with him like something that had been said and couldn't be unsaid. He thought about the river, the clarity of that decision, not debated, not weighed against alternatives, just made, because something in him had already known what it was going to do before his mind caught up. He thought about 3 years of making sure his life was small enough to stay safe. Not for himself. He'd stopped prioritizing his own safety sometime around his 4th deployment. For Ava. Because the thing that happened when he'd lost Sarah was that the world had demonstrated its capacity to take things away, and the response he'd chosen was to have fewer things that could be taken. It was a reasonable response. It was also the kind of response that worked until it stopped working, and it had, apparently, stopped working somewhere around a December bridge in a snowstorm. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window at the canyon. He thought about what Ava had said, which was the same thing Charlotte had said in the hospital in different words, which was the same thing he'd said out loud while on painkillers, which apparently needed to be said again in some more deliberate and less medically assisted context. He picked up his phone. He typed, "You free tonight? I'll cook. Don't say you don't need dinner." Her response came back in 3 minutes. "I'll be there at 7. I'm bringing dessert. Don't say you don't need dessert." He looked at that for a moment. Then he put the phone down and started figuring out what he could cook one-handed that was worth eating. It turned out to be a shorter list than he would have liked, but longer than he'd expected, which felt, in its small and undemonstrative way, like the right direction to be going. Dinner that night was pasta, which Logan made with his right hand doing most of the work, and his left side reminding him every few minutes that it had opinions about the situation. The sauce was from a jar, which he didn't apologize for, and the salad was the kind that comes from a bag, which Charlotte also didn't comment on. And they ate at the kitchen table with Ava between them, talking about her science fair project, a model demonstrating water filtration, with the focused intensity she brought to everything she decided mattered. It was ordinary in a way that Logan hadn't experienced in a long time. Not performed ordinariness, not the conscious reconstruction of routine that he'd been doing for 3 years, building a normal life for Ava out of discipline and intention. This was the actual thing. 2 adults and a child eating pasta at a kitchen table in a mountain town while snow accumulated on the windowsill outside. And nobody performing anything for anyone. Charlotte helped Ava with the dishes after, which Logan had told her she didn't need to do, and which she'd ignored with the particular selective hearing she deployed when she'd already decided something. He sat at the table and watched them at the sink, Charlotte washing, Ava drying with a dish towel that was too big for her hands, and listened to Ava explain the specific and apparently critical difference between igneous and sedimentary rock, which had come up tangentially in the science fair discussion and had since become its own conversation. "So they're both rocks," Charlotte said. "Yes, but they're made completely differently. One is from pressure and one is from heat." "Which is which?" Ava told her. Charlotte asked a follow-up question that was genuinely curious rather than performative, and Ava answered it with the satisfaction of someone whose expertise is being taken seriously. Logan thought about what it cost a person to be genuinely curious about an 8-year-old's knowledge of rock formation at 9:15 on a weeknight after the kind of week Charlotte had just had. Most people couldn't have managed it. Not because they were bad people, but because most people didn't have that particular quality. The ability to be fully where they were, regardless of what they'd just come from. Sarah had had it. He hadn't thought about that in a long time. He let himself think about it now. Not with the weight it used to carry, not with the particular grief of comparison, but with something that was closer to recognition. Some people were made a certain way. It didn't make them perfect. It made them real in a specific manner, and you either saw it or you didn't. And when you saw it in someone, it wasn't something you could easily unfeel. After Ava went to bed, negotiated bedtime 9:30, which Logan held firm on despite her argument that the science fair warranted a later exception, Charlotte and Logan sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the remains of the evening around them, and Logan said the thing he'd been carrying since the hospital. He said it plainly, without setup, because setup wasn't something he did well, and she'd already told him she preferred the direct version. "I haven't let anyone close since Sarah," he said. "Not because I decided not to. I just stopped making room for it, and I'm not sure I know how to do it properly after this long." Charlotte held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at him. "Okay," she said. "I'm saying I'm probably going to be bad at it." "Bad at what, specifically?" "At—" He paused. "Saying things when I should say them, making time in ways that don't look like contingency planning." He looked at the table. "Being someone who's present without also scanning the room." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "Logan, I run a company that almost got taken apart by a man I trusted for 9 years. I'm not particularly good at letting people close either. I'm better at the professional version of it than the actual version." She set the cup down. "I'm also going to be bad at it." "That's not reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was meant to be honest." She met his eyes. "I'd rather we're both honest about being bad at it than both pretend otherwise and then be surprised later." He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." "Okay," she said. It wasn't romantic in the cinematic sense. There was no particular moment that crystallized it. There was just two people at a kitchen table in a mountain town saying true things to each other at 9:45 at night, which is, more often than not, how the real things actually begin. Victor Crane's trial date was set for the following spring. His attorney's attempts to suppress the text evidence failed at every level, which Crane's legal team had probably anticipated but were contractually obligated to attempt anyway. Garrett Fossey negotiated a federal cooperation agreement in exchange for reduced charges, which his attorney presented as pragmatism and which the federal investigator Holt described to Charlotte in a brief and characteristically understated phone call as the most useful conversation I've had in this investigation. 3 other members of the Halcyon Network entered plea agreements in the months that followed. Richard Pell, who had attempted to guide Charlotte toward the private dining room on the night of the gala, resigned from the board before he was asked to and retained counsel the following week. The Meridian merger held. The integration took longer than projected, as integrations always did, and there were 3 months in early spring where the combined company's internal communications were in a state that Charlotte described to Logan one evening as organized chaos on its best days and something significantly less organized on its worst. But the structural fundamentals were sound, the whole point, the thing she'd built 7 years toward. And by April, the combined entity was reporting numbers that made the financial press revise the narrative they'd been constructing since Crane's arrest. Charlotte did not tell that story publicly. She let the numbers tell it. She'd learned, somewhere in her 20s, that outcomes were the only argument that didn't invite counterargument, and she'd never had much patience for narratives that required her to explain why she'd been right. The Hayes Military Family Foundation launched its formal operations in March, 6 months after the gala that had been its intended debut. The delay was deliberate. Charlotte had restructured the governance, brought in a director with actual nonprofit operational experience, and spent the intervening months making sure the foundation was built to last rather than built to look good in a press release. She asked Logan to serve as the foundation's security and operations advisor in a conversation that took place in the garage, because that was still the place where real conversations happened between them, and she asked him in the same direct, no-decoration way she asked for everything. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "You're a former Navy SEAL with tactical assessment skills and an understanding of what military families actually need that I don't have and can't hire." She sat on the workbench with her coffee, which she'd long since stopped asking permission to take. "I'm not asking you to become something you're not. I'm asking you to bring what you already are into something that needs it." He was under a customer's Bronco at the time, which meant his response came from somewhere near the floor. What would it actually involve? Security protocols for the foundation's events and staff, vetting of partner organizations. There are a lot of people who want to attach themselves to anything with a military family focus, and not all of them are operating in good faith. And honestly, she paused. Operational reality checks. I'm good at building things. I'm not always good at seeing the gaps in them until someone tries to walk through one. He rolled out from under the Bronco and looked at her. "You're describing what Desmond does. Desmond does corporate security. This is different. This is," she found the word, "community. It requires someone who understands that community from the inside." He sat up, wiped his hands on a rag, thought about it for a real moment rather than a performed one. He thought about the families he'd known in his years of service, the wives and husbands and children who'd carried the weight of deployments and the specific silence of waiting and the particular kind of damage that came after when the person came home but didn't entirely come back. He'd been one of them, on the returning end, and he knew what it felt like to be someone for whom all the available support structures were designed by people who understood the concept but not the texture. "Part-time," he said. "I'm not leaving the garage. I never asked you to. And I choose which engagements to weigh in on. I'm not a full-time security consultant." Agreed. "And if I think something is structurally wrong with how the foundation is operating, I tell you directly and you actually consider it instead of managing me." Charlotte looked at him. "When have I ever managed you?" He gave her a look. "Twice," she said, "and both times I was wrong. Fine." She held out her hand across the workbench. "Deal?" He shook it. "Deal." It was the most businesslike they'd been with each other in months, and it made them both laugh slightly, which neither of them entirely accounted for. The foundation's formal opening ceremony happened on a Friday afternoon in late March, at a community center in Denver that the foundation had helped renovate. It was not a gala. Charlotte had been specific about that. No donor tables, no keynote circuit, no champagne in a historic ballroom. Folding chairs and a small stage, and the people the foundation was actually for, which included 47 military families from around the state, several veteran service organizations, and a small press contingent that Charlotte had limited to 2 outlets on the grounds that the ceremony was for the families and not for coverage. The centerpiece was Ava's drawing. It had been Charlotte's idea, which she'd proposed to Ava directly, not through Logan, because she'd understood instinctively that this was a conversation between the two of them and didn't need an intermediary. She'd asked if the foundation could have the original, and if so, whether Ava would be willing to explain it at the opening ceremony. She'd asked it seriously, person to person, the same way she'd asked about igneous and sedimentary rock at the kitchen sink. Ava had said yes immediately, and then spent 2 weeks being carefully casual about how much she was thinking about it. The drawing had been professionally framed and was mounted on the wall at the back of the stage. Dark water, storm sky, 2 figures on a gray bank, one reaching. A child's rendering, crayon on copy paper, with all the particular sincerity that children's art carried when the child had drawn something true rather than something they thought the adult wanted to see. Ava stood at the microphone. It had been adjusted down for her, which she'd inspected beforehand with a technical seriousness that had made Logan pinch the bridge of his nose, and she explained the drawing in the plain and accurate language that was her natural register. "I drew it the winter my dad pulled someone out of a river," she said, into a room of about 120 people who were very quiet. "I didn't know who she was at the time. I just knew what he did, and I wanted to remember it, because he didn't tell anyone. He just did it and came back to the truck, and we drove home." She looked at the drawing on the wall. "My dad did things like that a lot of times in the military. He didn't talk about them. A lot of people in this room probably know someone like that. Someone who did hard things and didn't make a lot of noise about it." She paused, with the timing of someone who had thought about what she was going to say and was making sure she said it right. "I think those are the people who need the most help afterward because they're the worst at asking for it." The room was very quiet. "My dad is still bad at asking for it," Ava said, "but he's getting better." Logan, in the third row, looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had been ambushed in public by his own child and was choosing to accept it with dignity. Charlotte, at the edge of the stage, was doing the thing where she pressed her lips together to contain something. She caught Logan's eye. He raised his eyebrows slightly. She looked away before she lost the composure battle. Ava stepped back from the microphone with the satisfaction of someone who had said what they meant to say. The room began to clap, and it built into the kind of applause that wasn't polite or performed, the kind that comes when a room full of people recognizes something true and responds to it physically because there isn't another way. Charlotte spoke after Ava, and she was good as she always was, specific and warm and precise, no waste, no sentiment that wasn't earned by what she'd actually said. She talked about what the foundation was for and what it wasn't for, and she made a distinction that she'd been working on for months, and that Logan had helped her sharpen in a conversation at the garage kitchen table one evening when Ava was doing homework. "This foundation doesn't exist to thank military families," she said. "We don't think you need to be thanked. We think you need support, which is a different thing, and we're going to try to provide it in ways that are actually useful instead of ways that make the people providing it feel good about themselves." Afterward, during the reception, Logan moved through the room slowly. The ribs were still communicating their objections to extended standing, which he was managing through selective stubbornness. And he talked to people, families mostly. He listened more than he spoke, which was his natural proportion. A woman whose husband had come back from 2 overseas tours with damage that didn't show on any scan and that nobody had known how to address until it became a crisis. A 22-year-old who'd left service after 18 months for reasons that were complicated and who was still working out who he was outside of it. A 12-year-old whose mother was currently deployed and who told Logan, with the directness of a kid who'd learned to be practical about hard things, that the worst part was not the missing, but the not knowing what to miss about specifically. Logan talked with the 12-year-old for 15 minutes. He told her plainly that it didn't get smaller, the not knowing, but that you got better at carrying it. He said it without trying to make it better than it was, which she received with the relief that direct honesty produces in people who've been given the managed version too many times. He didn't think of it as significant in the moment. He was just talking to a kid who needed someone to talk to. But Charlotte saw it from across the room, and when he found her later at the edge of the reception, she looked at him with an expression that said she'd seen it and had something to say about it and was choosing to say it quietly. "That's what the foundation needed," she said. "Not the structure or the governance or the event. That." He looked across the room at where the girl was now talking to her grandmother. "I just told her the truth." "I know, that's exactly what I mean." He thought about that for a moment. He thought about Reyes, who was not at the reception because he was constitutionally opposed to events with folding chairs and had expressed this clearly, but who had told Logan on the phone 3 weeks prior that what Charlotte was building was the right idea, implemented by the right person. He thought about Desmond, who was in the room doing the thing he always did, covering the perimeter with enough unobtrusiveness that most people didn't notice him doing it, which was, Logan had come to understand, the highest form of professional respect Desmond offered anyone. He thought about Ava at the microphone, Not nervous, just precise, saying the true thing without ornamentation. He thought about a bridge in December. There was a version of himself, the version that had existed 2 years ago, or 5, that would have looked at this room and calculated exit routes, not from danger, just from involvement, from the weight of things that could be taken away. He'd spent a long time being careful, which was rational, and also in the way that rational things sometimes were, quietly corrosive. You can protect yourself out of a life. You can be so careful about what you let in that the care itself becomes the damage. He didn't know when exactly that had changed. He suspected it had changed the moment he went over a guardrail in a snowstorm without deciding to, which meant it had probably already changed before that, in some way he hadn't yet measured. The first snow of the following winter came on a Saturday in late November, which was a year and 2 weeks after the bridge. It came in the night and was still coming in the morning. Not a blizzard, not the kind that made canyons dangerous, just the first good snowfall of the season, the kind that made everything quiet and clean and new for the approximate 4 hours before the plows came through. Logan was in the garage when it started, working on a customer's truck that he'd promised for Monday, and he watched it through the bay door he'd left cracked. The way the light changed when snow was in the air, going gray and diffuse well before the first flake arrived. Charlotte came at 11 because she spent Saturday mornings at her apartment in Denver doing the work she couldn't get to during the week, and Saturday afternoons in Idaho Springs, which had become the arrangement without anyone specifically deciding on it. She pulled up in the gray Honda, which she'd bought rather than returned after the rental, and she came through the side door of the garage with 2 coffees from the diner that she'd picked up on the main street. She handed Logan his without comment. He took it. "Snowing in Denver?" he asked. "Starting to. It'll stick by this afternoon." She looked out the bay door at the canyon. The creek was low in November, barely visible under the gray-white sky. "First real snow." "Yeah." She stood next to him and drank her coffee and looked at the snow coming down in the quiet way that first snows came, without the violence of what they could become. She was in a heavy sweater and her barn jacket and jeans and boots that had, over the past year, actually accumulated mud. He'd pointed this out once and she'd said, "I live in Colorado," with the flat delivery that meant she found the observation unnecessary. "Ava's almost done with the science fair display," Charlotte said. "She wants to set it up in the waiting room. It's for school. It's for science. She wants more audience." Charlotte looked at him sideways. "I already told her yes." "You—" He stopped. "You can't just—" "I told her I'd clear it with you, but I was pretty confident you'd say yes. You were confident I'd say yes to a science fair display in my waiting area. You haven't said no yet." This was technically accurate. He drank his coffee. "It's about water filtration," Charlotte said. "It's relevant to a garage." "How is a water filtration display relevant to a garage?" "Water is used in garages." "No." She said it without any particular inflection. "I'm sure there's a specific application. She'll explain it." Logan looked at the snow. The snow fell with complete indifference to the conversation happening below it. "Fine," he said. "I knew you'd say that." "You knew I'd say fine." "I knew you'd say fine while making that exact face." "What face?" "The one where you're pretending to be more annoyed than you are." He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him, not with any particular significance, just looking at him. The way people look at each other when they've been around each other long enough to stop editing the looking. He thought about what it meant, that a year had gone by, a year of this specific life. The garage, the kitchen table, the coffee from the diner on Saturday mornings, the phone calls at 9:45 when one of them had had a hard day and needed to hear a voice that wasn't performing anything. It had not been smooth. There had been a period in early spring when Charlotte's work pressure had become so consuming that she'd been unreachable for 10 days in a way that wasn't deliberate but landed badly, and they'd had a conversation about it that was blunt on both sides and left them both slightly raw for a few days after. There had been a night in summer when Logan had woken from a dream that was old and specific and had sat in the kitchen until 3 a.m., and Charlotte had called in the morning, not because she'd known, just because she called on Saturdays. And he'd told her, briefly and without much ornamentation, and she'd listened without filling it up with response, which was exactly right. It had not been perfect. Neither of them were. The relevant thing, Logan had come to understand, was not the absence of rough edges, but what you did with them. Whether you sanded them down into a polished falseness, or whether you stayed close enough to someone that the edges just became part of the texture of the thing. "I want to show you something," Ava said from the door behind them. They both turned. She was in her purple coat, a new one this year, same style, slightly larger, but she'd transferred the iron-on patch from the old one to the new one's elbow, which Logan had clocked when she first wore it and hadn't mentioned because it felt like something that should be allowed to exist without commentary. She was holding something rolled up in her hands. She came out into the garage bay, which she was always technically not supposed to be in when equipment was running, and Logan didn't say anything about it, and she unrolled what she was holding and held it up. It was a new drawing, larger than the original. She'd moved up to proper drawing paper this year, the kind Charlotte had brought her from an art supply store in Denver after Ava mentioned once that she'd wanted to try it. The same scene, the river, the figures. But different, because the hand was better now, the eye more practiced, the scene more fully rendered. The dark water had depth in it. The figures on the bank were distinct, one larger, crouching, and a woman sitting up with her hand raised, and behind them, on the bank, a small detail that the first drawing hadn't had, the headlights of a truck on the road above, casting light down through the dark. "I made another one," Ava said. "For us. Not for the foundation. For here." Logan looked at it for a long moment. "Where do you want to put it?" Charlotte asked her. Ava looked around the garage. She pointed to the wall beside the bay door. The wall that faced out toward the canyon, that caught the morning light and the last of the afternoon light, and that was, in the winter, visible from the road. "There," she said, "so people can see it when they come in." Logan looked at the wall. He looked at the drawing. He thought about a night a year ago when he'd been driving home from a school play with his daughter in the back seat, and a vehicle had gone off a bridge, and the 4 seconds of decision that had preceded everything that came after. He thought about what Ava had said at the microphone. Those are the people who need the most help afterward, because they're the worst at asking for it. He thought she was right. He thought he'd spent a long time being the worst at asking for it, and that he was getting better, slowly, in the way that fundamental things changed. Not all at once, not with a clean before and after, but incrementally, one honest conversation at a time, one Saturday morning at a time, one small surrender of the careful distance that had kept him functional, and also, in its way, alone. Not every lesson comes wrapped neatly. Most of the real ones arrive sideways, through a car that needs a CV joint, or a child who says true things at kitchen tables, or a woman who stays in a hospital waiting room for 3 hours without being asked and doesn't make it into something more complicated than what it is. You don't recognize the lesson while it's happening. You recognize it later, standing in a garage in the first snow of winter with coffee going cold in your hand, looking at a drawing your daughter made of the night your life changed direction without asking your permission. "Yeah," Logan said. "There's good." He got the hammer and a picture hook from the supply shelf. Charlotte held the drawing against the wall, adjusting it left and right with the kind of care she brought to anything she was doing, until it was right. Ava stood back and evaluated with her head tilted and one eye slightly narrowed. "More left," she said. Charlotte moved it. "More." "Ava, we're at the edge of the—" "There," Ava said. "That's it." Logan put the hook in. Charlotte held it against the nail, and he stepped back, and they both looked at it on the wall. The dark water and the gray bank and the 2 figures and the light coming down from the road above. Crayon on drawing paper in a wood frame in a garage in a mountain town, in the middle of the first snow of a new winter. He had not become someone different. That was the thing he'd spent a long time being afraid of, that letting people in would require him to become someone he wasn't. He was still the same man who'd rebuilt the truck engine twice and preferred silence to most conversation, and woke up sometimes in the night from dreams that were old and specific. He was still the same man who went over railings without deciding to, and who found it difficult to say things when he should say them, and who had a daughter who was 8 years old and better at being honest than most adults he'd ever known. He just wasn't alone in it anymore. That was not a small thing. It was actually one of the most significant things he'd managed in several years, and he was under no illusion that he'd managed it on his own or that it had been easy or that it was finished. These things were never finished. They were ongoing. They required daily choice and occasional failure, and the particular willingness to keep going after the failure, which was the part that nobody talked about much, but that was, in the end, the actual work. Charlotte bumped her shoulder against his, lightly, the way you do when you're standing close enough to someone that the small contact is available and you take it without making a production of it. He didn't move away. Outside, the snow came down on the canyon and the creek and the road, on the mountain town and the garage and the gravel lot with the sign that said Carter and Son Automotive, and the morning was white and quiet and entirely ordinary, which was exactly what it was supposed to be. Ava had already moved on to something else. She was examining the workbench with the particular focus of a child who has decided to see what's interesting there. And Charlotte was drinking her coffee and looking out the bay door at the snow, and Logan stood between the two of them in the garage that smelled like oil and cold air and was, against every plan he'd made for himself, completely full. He didn't say anything about it. He drank his coffee and watched the snow and let it be what it was. Some things you protect by saying them out loud. Some things you protect by just standing in them, present, without looking for the exit. Logan Carter had spent a long time being very good at finding exits. He was done with that now.